Excuse me, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
To think is to be that which is visualized in the mind, becomes part of the possessor of that mind, because a man is what he thinks. It is strange how little we know about the mind. Not much more has been determined about it since the time of Descartes and his brilliant basic premise, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. We only know we exist because we think. Should thought stop in us, we automatically would cease to be. Should thought begin at any particular point in space, that point immediately would begin to live. It is deeply significant that we exist by grace of thought, and it is even more significant that at any particular time we are the sum total of the thoughts we hold in mind. It seems reasonable to assume that the thinking being that inhabits us is thought itself, that the more complex and universal our thoughts are, the more complex and universal we become. It is impossible to separate the image in the mind of a beholder from the beholder himself, because in a very real sense, the two are one. That which achieves the attention of consciousness becomes that consciousness, becomes that consciousness. When our attention is focused on something, we become that thing. It is this power of consciousness, that it becomes the thought it thinks, which gives the mind such ascendancy over matter. Man's investigation of the outer world has practically conquered space and time, but he still knows very little about what his own mind is and what its influences are. Because thought is invisible, it never has come under the scrutiny of the laboratory microscope. As a consequence, men are nearly as poorly informed about the qualities and processes of thought as they were at the dawn of written history. Even though it is recognized now that the thoughts a person thinks determine his whole life, the average man continues to think in response to sensual stimuli, rather than in response to his inner wishes and desires. Mental law the thought first, then the thing, that is the law. But the vast majority of people live on the opposite premise, the thing first, then the thought. The power of mental imagery still works, even in this reversal of form. But in this case, it merely lends validity to everything they see and every situation they encounter. Such people are unable to grow beyond the limitation of their own emotions, for they give credence to all sensual stimuli. Each such stimulus becomes bound up in an emotional reaction. Whenever they encounter an event or thing which they have encountered before, they react in a predetermined manner. It thus becomes impossible for them to progress into any degree of effective living, for by the very nature of their mental position, the things of the world control them, they never control the things. They are either fearful or hostile, resentful, envious, or sad, but each of these emotions is inspired by a stimulus from outside and never by inner convictions or desires. These are the people who are the most strenuous defenders of their mental aberrations. In argument, they are easily provoked to hysteria. Since their convictions are insisted in emotion, they defend them with their lives, convinced of ultimate disaster should their delusions be dissolved. The most fortunate thing that can happen is that life reduce their egos to nothingness. To a great extent, their eyes are then cleared, and they are able finally to see that they have always reacted rather than acted. When humility enters a man's soul, he at last is able to perceive that he does not live alone in the world, but with millions of brothers, and that hidden in the heart of each is the same animating spirit. Forecaster of the future to know is nothing at all. To imagine is everything, wrote Anatole France. That which seizes the attention of our consciousness is an infallible forecaster of the future. Indeed, were we to know the thoughts that occupy a man's mind, we might provide him an accurate description of his coming life, down to the most intimate detail. The success of fortune-tellers, via whatever medium they use, cards, tea leaves, crystal balls, is always the result of a telepathic communication between seer and subject. The thoughts that possess us lead us around by the mental noses. There is in thought a motor impulse that compels us to do the things we think about, and this is a law far above moral or ethical considerations. It works just as quickly for what is considered evil as it does for what is considered good. If you keep thinking about robbing the corner service station, and you keep this image in your mind for several weeks, you one day will find yourself at the service station, gun in hand, prepared to empty the till. People who commit so-called crimes of passion often report they were in the grip of a compulsion they could neither control nor understand. Such compulsion proceeds out of their thoughts. Images projected into the moving screen of mind finally take root in the motor impulses of the body, and each person is propelled into the action he visualizes in the deeper recesses of his consciousness. The Dhammapada cautions us to guard our thoughts, and indeed we should. Everything that is admitted into our mind takes shape, form, and substance in our lives, and we can stop this from happening only by ceasing to live. For the law of life is the law of life, is the law of thoughts becoming things. Clear thinking, the quality of our mental imagery, determines how quickly we get effects in the outer world. Since most people are relatively unaware of thinking at all, they give little consideration to how well they think, to the clarity and reality of the images they envisage. Most of us are fuzzy thinkers. When we call something to mind, it comes to us as a vague and shadowy presence. We do not really see it, feel it, hear it, touch it, penetrate it, take it unto us, but rather are dimly aware of it by means of some verbal grasp of its idea. We say, my house, but the image does not call to mind the actual house, only a vague idea of it in terms of whether the taxes have to be paid, the outside walls painted, the lawn mowed, or a party given there Saturday night. We adopt meanings about everything in terms of personal significance, but we seldom conjure up images in our consciousness for the simple reason that we never have trained ourselves to think that way, never have truly understood the significance of such images. Think about something familiar. Think of a room in which you spend a great deal of time. See yourself sitting in some particular chair in that room. Look around. What do you see? Are there pictures on the walls? Where and what kind? What are their colours? Where are the furniture books, papers? Is there dust gathered in the corners? Where are the lamps? How do they operate? See yourself in that room with such intensity that you actually feel that you are there. See the colour, the solidity of objects. Work on this for a few days. If you are lucky, you will have an experience that will startle you. During one of these meditation periods, while you are visiting this room in your mind, you will have the sudden feeling that you actually are there. When this experience comes to you, you will be there in a very real, though psychic sense, such is the tremendous power of correct and clear mental visualization. Adore a jar. There are other tests you can take to convince yourself how fuzzy your thinking has been and how much power lies in making it clear. If you are married, try suddenly to call to mind the face of your spouse. You may be shocked to realize how difficult this is. What you immediately call to mind is an idea of your spouse, and this idea has the wavering shape of a shadowy dream. Concentrate on making his or her face as clear in your mind as a photograph. Bend the entire effort of your attention toward this end. Gradually the picture will clear. Soon you will see that face before you, animated, alive, vibrant, so that you feel certain that if you reached out you could touch a cheek with your fingertips. Don't be surprised that evening if your husband or wife says to you, "I was thinking about you all day today." This is not legend or superstition or wishful thinking. When we deal with the mind, we are dealing with the most significant thing in life. There are undreamed of powers in consciousness, and they have not even been tapped. Our first fumbling attempts to understand the paranormal will be very amusing to researchers 100 years from now. The current awakening to telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition have barely jarred the door into an enormous storehouse of fantastic powers and perceptions. We take our first step on the proper path when we realize the original power of mind over matter and how our thoughts influence the world we live in. Once we truly have apprehended the tremendous force that propels a mental image to become a physical fact, then we see that we must dedicate our efforts to becoming clear and concise thinkers rather than rushers around in the world. Psychic imbalance we must learn to visualize with complete clarity, so that an image called up in mind exists with the same solidity, color, and dimension as one in the physical world. Research conducted into the content of dreams has revealed that some people dream in black and white, while others dream in color. Others dream in color. Others dream in pantomime. Still others with full sound effects. Some people's dreams are populated with folks without faces, and in some people's dreams it is always night. In others it is always day. Such research has proved pretty well that emotional blocks in the subconscious restrict the individual from completely visualizing things in his mind. A man might attempt to envision himself successfully completing a task which he desires to do, But no matter how hard he tries to focus his inner attention, he never can quite see himself in that position. If it would finally involve a change of residence, for example, he might report that he is able to see the new home and everything in it, but is unable to visualize himself there. It is the subconscious that blocks him out from such visualization. Some fear or hostility or resentment has given him a deep mental block about moving and forbids the picture from entering his mind and thereby bars the actual event from happening in the physical world. It is no easy matter for him to overcome this subconscious censoring of his thoughts. It represents a wrong self-identification, a psychic imbalance. This psychic imbalance is universally caused by the centering of consciousness in the ego rather than in the deeper regions of being. A man who allows his surface self to control his life is in the grip of a Lilliputian ghost. He eventually will become bound up mentally by thousands of little prompters that proceed out of his subconscious. It is they that give form and substance to his ego, the thing he regards as himself, which is never himself at all, but only the limitations that he has accepted and come to regard as real. Subconscious promptings, modern psychoanalysis, in order to test the psychic imbalance of the individual, uses a test devised by Rorschach, in which the subconscious preoccupation of a patient is diagnosed from spontaneous images which he sees in complex ink blots. Since the ink blots are haphazard and multiform, it follows that the images that the patient sees in them represent the kind of thing that his consciousness is habitually focused upon. In other words, the test provides a key to the thoughts which occupy an individual's mind and gives the psychologist a method of interpreting neurosis. The premise that diagnosis is based upon is that each of us sees in all things the thoughts that, a priori, occupy our minds. Thus, life itself turns out to be nothing more or less than a gigantic Rorschach test. Shape and form and substance have infinite meaning and infinite possibility. To the individual beholder, each assumes colour and quality directly taken from the thoughts that occupy his consciousness. When we choose the thoughts, we think we choose our lives. The fact of the matter is that very few people are free to exercise choice in their thinking because the bulk of their thought erupts from pain, insistent memories in the subconscious. They are not free because they have wrongly identified themselves. Their sense of self is primarily the memories of events and relationships. In consequence, they assume themselves to be a changing thing, an ego, a sense of self built upon dimly remembered and barely perceived relationships. The ego thinks always in response to the subconscious. Only the great self, the sense of self free of the limitations of the ego, is able to originate thought or to be receptive to it in an unbiased manner. We all put too much value on the ego. Personality represents for us both a fascination and a delusion. By its very meaning, personality is restricted to the individual and thus represents a limited sense of self. Only from the wider and broader standpoint of the secret self is it possible for the individual mind to orient itself correctly with life. Thus it is able to grasp meanings and relationships from a larger and more encompassing standpoint, and to know by immediate perception rather than by reason and deduction. Instinctive performance, the ego thinks from a small standpoint in the center. It thinks outward. It seeks to know by groping into the unknown, attempting to rationalize what it finds there. Since infinite space surrounds it, it is impossible for it ever to grow into great understanding. Since what it thinks is colored by what it already knows, and since what it knows is based upon a strictly personal and infinitesimal interpretation, it therefore, by its very nature, cannot ever arrive at true knowledge. Before a man can be truly wise, before he can arrive at his birthright of power and understanding, he must in some degree shuck off the trappings of the ego and take on a wider kind of consciousness. Instead of being a central thinker, he must learn to be a peripheral or outer thinker. He must learn to allow thought to develop in him under the impulsion of something outside of and greater than himself. He must learn to be able to do things without focusing his attention upon them. He must learn to perform them through an instinctive understanding of their true nature and the job to be done. The ego prevents a man from performing in this manner. To be self-conscious is to be fearful and restricted. The instinctive and natural performer thinks with his outer and wider mind. He who is enwrapped in consideration of his ego and sense of self is bound up in fear and tension during the simplest of tasks. That which we do well we do not think about. We simply perform by grace of our outer and wider mind. When we lose our contact with this mind, we fall from grace with a bang, for all by ourselves, focused upon each little movement, we cannot perform the simplest of tasks. The centipede was happy quite until a toad in fun said, "Pray, which leg goes after which?" That worked her mind to such a pitch, she lay distracted in a ditch considering how to run. Mrs. Edward Craster, there seems to be absolutely no limit to the feats the human being can perform when he is able to grasp them with his outer or peripheral mind. A man stands on the forefinger of one, hand atop 100-foot pole. Another walks a tightrope across the chasm of Niagara Falls. Another springs from a board and turns 3 somersaults in the air before landing on his feet. Still another juggles a dozen balls at a time. Watching such performances, we are astounded. How is it possible, we ask ourselves, for a human being to do such things? It is possible because the man has mastered the knack of performing without thought. He has learned to shut off the thinking of his central self and to stand outside, as it were, grasping his whole action as a continuous thing, seeing it as a single, flowing, unbroken movement. As a consequence, arms and legs move, muscles coordinate, energy is expended, all at the behest of a complete picture held by his wider mind. He performs from the spine, unthinkingly, responds only to the image of what he wants to do, just as another man might walk down the street, thinking only of where he wants to go, and never of the act of putting one foot in front of the other.